What's up, guys? Static in the Attic. Wow, all I can say. The more I dig into this, the more I see that what we have for history is just as much populist history as what I see on the internet these days. Is basically whatever you can convince anybody is true. For the last 40 years, we've had civil rights activists and Lincoln fanboys telling us what happened with the War of Secession. And guys, I am honestly shocked of what I've found out about what's happened in America. Historians will even tell you that Abraham Lincoln was basically a dictatorship in America. They suspended the writ of habeas corpus to where you have no right to due process. As many as 30,000 Northerners were jailed for speaking favorably of the South or speaking ill of the Lincoln administration. Armed guards were sent to federal judges' houses to make sure that they didn't leave, place them under house arrest so they could not go to court to do their job because they were against Lincoln. Newspaper editors were arrested and jailed, their presses broken. I mean, guys, this is literally a full on takeover of the US government that suspended all rights granted by the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The list goes on, and I was honestly shocked by what actually went down. And no wonder they don't want anyone digging into the real truth of this stuff. They just want you to keep repeating the civil rights narrative and Emancipation Proclamation and all this. And it's pretty unbelievable. But not only the South, but basically the North was put under martial law by the end of this dictatorship. But I'll cover all that in a later video. You guys should check out this playlist I've got going, the unedited history of America, where I'm going through, I'm showing all the lies you've been told about slavery. And I'm just amazed right now at how off our version of history that we're taught is. And that's kind of saying something, as many lies as I've uncovered about our history on this channel. In my last video on this subject, I showed how between the years of basically 1820 to 1860, the North imported so many wage slave laborers to work in their factories that they gained so many electoral votes during that time period that just between New York and Pennsylvania, they had enough electoral votes to outvote the entire 10 states of the South. Abraham Lincoln was not even on the ballot in the 10 southern states. And when he was elected, everybody in the South was pissed because they realized, well, wait a minute, 2 states in the North have enough power to outvote all of us in the South. So we're done with this agreement. We had a confederation of states and we're out. We are seceding from this union. We're breaking this contract. Now, I want to point out that in 1814, I believe it was, 1804 or 1814, Connecticut decided they were going to secede from the Union, and it never was a question whether they had the right to. Everyone knew that they had the right to secede from the Union. In the original writing of the Declaration of Independence, it stated, "We the people of Pennsylvania, New York, Georgia, Virginia." It listed each of the 13 colonies as individual states with state sovereign rights. In the final draft, they shortened this to "We the people of the United States of America." But there was no entity of the time called the United States of America. They were saying that we are a united confederation. When they signed the treaty with the King of England after the Revolutionary War, it was a treaty between the king and each individual state. They listed each individual state. There was no entity called the United States. So when Lincoln won without being on a single ballot, not getting one single vote from half of these United States, the southern states called foul, said, "That's it, we're out. This contract is done. We want nothing to do with you." And the North would not let them walk away. They wouldn't let them secede. They invaded the South. It is no different than if Canada invaded America. They were sovereign states who reserved their own sovereign rights to declare war, to levy taxes. It was perfectly acceptable for Kentucky to wage war with Tennessee at that time. I'll just put it that way. So Southerners were pissed when he got elected, And an editorial in the Atlanta Southern Confederacy wrote, "Let the consequences be what they may, whether the Potomac is crimson in human gore and Pennsylvania Avenue is paved 10 fathoms deep with mangled bodies, or whether the last vestige of liberty is swept from the face of the American continent, the South will never submit to such humiliation and degradation as the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln." Now, Lincoln was still out on a tour of the nation campaigning when he got elected, and now half the country wants to assassinate him. Not just the North, or not just the South, but many northern states were against the election of Lincoln. So I've heard many rumors about what happened, like Lincoln having to wear disguises and changing trains, secretly and all this. But what I'm about to tell you is not rumor whatsoever. This is all fact. And the last little bit has completely been scrubbed from the internet. But there were many rumors circulating at the time of the Baltimore plot, the plot to assassinate Lincoln before his inauguration. And, they were worried about the whole train line getting blown up. I mean, people weren't messing around these days. You could buy cannons, you could buy dynamite, everything. So they did not rule out blowing up a train bridge or just blowing up the whole train and derailing it. So the people behind Lincoln had to call in Alan Pinkerton of the famous Pinkerton Detective Agency to keep him safe. Just so you know, by the time of westward expansion and Manifest Destiny, the Pinkerton Detective Agency had as many as 30,000 detectives working under it. They were more powerful than the U.S. Army at the time. Now, I'm just getting into this part of things, but I have a very strong feeling that the Pinkerton Detective Agency has a lot to do with the muscle of our shadow government, the formation of the FBI, CIA, and all of that. But Pinkerton was hired to keep Lincoln safe, keep him alive until he got into office, and I'm sure all throughout. But it says that Pinkerton and several of his agents, including Kate Warren, who I'll get to in a second, infiltrated meetings of a secret society. This group was called the Knights of the Golden Circle, who planned the creation of a new nation. In a former video on slavery, I showed how these secret societies that we learned about, one of them has 3 Ks, is not exactly what we've been told, because I have firsthand accounts of a freed man saying that that society came to their house and shot the master, the white master, and left all of the slaves alone. But that's a pretty detailed subject on its own. On February 21st, 1861, Lincoln's train arrived in Philadelphia. About 100,000 people were there to welcome him. He did speeches, went to a concert, all this stuff. Being a politician, around 10:15 in the evening, Lincoln prepared for bed, but received a note urging him to go to the room of his advisor, Norman Judd. 10 minutes later, Lincoln entered the room, was introduced to Alan Pinkerton, and he said, "Look, there are plots against your life. I'm taking these threats very seriously." Long story short, Kate Warren, you guys want to talk about women's rights? She was a detective in the 1860s for Alan Pinkerton. She had to go to the train station and give this BS story about her invalid brother that wasn't good around crowds. So could we get a seat at the back of the train behind curtains and all of this stuff? So basically they had to smuggle Abraham Lincoln into Washington, D.C. because a rather large portion of the country understood that he was just a Manchurian candidate. He didn't actually win the election. So when he arrived in Washington, it was a surprise to everyone, especially James Buchanan, the sitting president at the time. He called on the White House and needed protection, basically. Now, this next bit you will not find anywhere on the internet. It's been completely scrubbed. Horace Greeley is quite famous. He was the newspaper editor responsible for, if you've ever heard the saying, "Go West, young man." That was him. It was just a marketing campaign to get the cheap wage slave labor to go from the East Coast and spread out through the Midwest so that everybody had these cheap laborers that they were importing. But thankfully, due to this interview from Smithsonian Magazine, this is a very credible source on this quote that I'm giving you here. Greeley later recounts this about the inauguration. Quote, I sat just behind him as he read it, expecting to hear its delivery arrested by the crack of a rifle aimed at his heart. It pleased God to postpone the deed, though there were 40 times the reason for shooting him in 1861 than 1865, and at least 40 times as many intent on killing him or having him killed. No shot was then fired, however, for his hour had not yet come. So I will have much more on this subject. I feel like I'm just scratching the surface right now, but I want everyone to understand that, oh, Honest Abe, the champion of civil rights and the Emancipation Proclamation, was a hated Manchurian candidate by a large portion of America. And then once in office, he ruled as basically a dictator in this country that you will not believe what actually happened. This was after, 70 years of fighting against central banks in this country. And then as soon as Lincoln got in, they started issuing greenbacks of fiat currency to finance the war. And basically, Lincoln just sounds like he was a puppet of the big moneyed interest of the North, the robber barons, the factory magnates. And true historians make no bones about it. This was a war of political ideas over how the rest of the country would be managed. It was either slave or wage slave labor. And it wasn't so much an issue about slavery in the South as all of the new states joining the Union, whether they were to be wage or slave. It was a topic that had cooled down a little bit after the Missouri Compromise in 1820, saying, okay, well, these states will be neutral until we figure this out. And I think it's also important to understand that during the Revolutionary War, the War of Independence of 1776, there were people of all races fighting side by side. Some of them were slaves that went on to be freedmen because all of the colonies in America were fighting for their freedom, and it created, a moral conflict because the founding fathers were not blind to the fact that they're fighting for their freedom while owning other people. So a lot of people earn their freedom through the War of Independence. So, like I said many times before, all history is a lie, but history did happen. All of the events of history of the last 500-600 years did happen. It's just you're given Darth Vader's perspective on things because the Empire's already won. Anyway, stick around because this is getting pretty deep. Static out.